The world before 1914 was a masterpiece built on lies of peace. Every empire called itself civilized. Every king believed his nation was destined for greatness. And every army marched under the illusion that war was a thing of the past. But behind that calm surface, Europe was a powder keg, and all it needed was a spark. For decades, powerful nations had been racing to dominate the world. The British Empire ruled the seas and boasted colonies on every continent. France had vast territories across Africa and Asia. And then came Germany, a young, ambitious empire, rising fast, hungry to prove itself. It had the strongest army in Europe, booming industries, and a desire to be recognized as the greatest power on earth. But there was one problem. The old powers didn't want to share. Britain and France saw Germany as a threat. Germany saw them as enemies standing in its way. And every country built more battleships, more guns, and more alliances in the name of protection. These alliances were meant to keep peace, but in reality, they created a trap. If one nation went to war, everyone else would be dragged in. Two great camps formed. On one side, the Triple Entente, made up of Britain, France, and Russia. On the other, the Triple Alliance, led by Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. A single spark could set the entire continent ablaze. That spark came on June 28, 1914. In the city of Sarajevo, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. A young man named Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old Serbian nationalist, waited on a crowded street. When the open car carrying Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, passed by, he fired 2 bullets. One hit the Archduke. The other struck his wife, Sophie. Both died within minutes. It was an assassination that echoed across the world. Austria-Hungary was furious. They blamed Serbia, where Princip and his group had support. They demanded impossible terms, knowing Serbia could never accept. When Serbia hesitated, Austria declared war. And that was the moment the alliances awoke. Germany backed Austria-Hungary, promising total support. Russia mobilized to defend Serbia. France prepared to back Russia. And when Germany invaded Belgium to strike France, Britain declared war too. In just a week, Europe descended into chaos. Crowds cheered in the streets. Soldiers marched off with smiles, believing they'd be home by Christmas. No one imagined that the war would drag on for 4 years, killing over 16 million people and reshaping the world forever. The war spread like wildfire. From the skies to the seas, from the deserts of Africa to the fields of France, it consumed everything. It wasn't just armies fighting, it was entire nations. Factories became weapon workshops. Civilians were drafted into war efforts. And the new face of warfare was born: industrial destruction. By late 1914, soldiers dug into trenches stretching hundreds of miles across France and Belgium. The Western Front became a graveyard of mud, blood, and barbed wire. Men lived in filth, surrounded by rats, disease, and the constant sound of artillery. For a few feet of land, thousands died. Machine guns tore through waves of soldiers. Poison gas choked the air, and artillery shells rained down day and night. The world had never seen horror like this before. In the east, Russia clashed with Germany and Austria in vast, freezing battles. In the south, the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, opening new fronts in the Middle East. In Asia and Africa, colonies fought under flags they barely understood. The war had truly become global. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the United States watched the chaos unfold. President Woodrow Wilson declared neutrality. America, he said, would stay out of Europe's madness. But neutrality didn't mean indifference. The U.S. economy boomed, selling food, weapons, and supplies, mostly to the Allies. American ships carried goods across the Atlantic, making America the arsenal of democracy long before it entered the fight. Yet even as Americans prospered, they couldn't ignore the headlines. The Western Front had turned into a nightmare. Entire towns disappeared under shellfire. Families starved. Millions of young men never came home. And for the first time, modern technology, radio, cameras, newspapers showed the world what war truly looked like. In Europe, governments used propaganda to keep spirits high. Posters called the enemy monsters and soldiers heroes. But the letters from the front told another story. A story of fear, confusion, and endless death. The war that was supposed to bring glory had only brought grief. Meanwhile, in America, opinions were divided. Some felt the U.S. had no business getting involved in Europe's quarrels. Others believed staying neutral, while innocent people were slaughtered, was a betrayal of American values. But as long as the war stayed overseas, most Americans preferred peace. Still, the war had a way of reaching across oceans. Germany, desperate to cut off Britain's supply lines, turned to submarine warfare. Their deadly U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking any ship they believed carried goods for the Allies. And in May 1915, the world was shocked when a German submarine torpedoed the Lusitania, a British passenger ship. It sank in less than 20 minutes, taking 1,198 lives, including 128 Americans. The outcry in the United States was immediate. Newspapers called it murder. People demanded revenge. But President Wilson resisted the pressure. He sent angry diplomatic notes, but refused to enter the war. He believed America could still be the voice of peace in a world gone mad. As 1916 turned to 1917, the war only grew bloodier. Millions were dead. The trenches hadn't moved. Entire generations were being erased. And the governments of Europe were collapsing under the strain. Germany, facing starvation and shortages, decided to gamble. They resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, knowing it would probably bring America into the war, but hoping to win before that happened. It was a desperate move, one that would change everything. Then, in early 1917, came the message that shattered American neutrality forever. British intelligence intercepted a secret telegram from Germany's foreign minister, Arthur Zimmermann, to Mexico. The message promised Mexico that if it joined Germany in war against the United States, it would be rewarded with the return of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. When the British revealed the telegram to the world, Americans were outraged that IT was the final straw. The illusion of neutrality vanished overnight. America could no longer stand by while its ships were sunk, its people killed, and its borders threatened. By April 1917, President Wilson stood before Congress and declared that the world must be made safe for democracy. The United States was going to war. The news rippled through every town, every city, every heart across America. Factories switched to war production. Men lined up to enlist. Posters urged people to buy war bonds and support the troops. Women took over jobs and factories, farms and offices, proving they could do the work of men while their brothers and sons fought overseas. For a nation that had stayed out of Europe's conflicts for over a century, the entry into World War I marked a new chapter in history. America was no longer just a rising power. It was stepping onto the world stage. Across the ocean, the Allies cheered. American troops, young, energetic, and full of spirit, would soon arrive to turn the tide of war. But no one knew just how hard the road ahead would be. The trenches still waited. The guns still roared. And the world was still burning. The spark that started in Sarajevo had become a storm that swallowed continents. What began as one assassination had turned into the deadliest conflict the world had ever known. Kings and emperors who thought they could control destiny now watched their empires crumble. Millions of families mourned sons they would never see again. And humanity began to wonder if civilization itself could survive the war it had unleashed. For America, the journey was just beginning. It was time for the new world to enter the old world's war. The question wasn't just whether the Allies could win, but whether the world could ever recover from what it had become. When America entered the inferno, why World War I started. Europe was bleeding. For years of endless fighting had turned fields into wastelands and hope into dust. Armies were exhausted. Economies were collapsing, and entire nations teetered on the edge of ruin. The Great War had become a nightmare no one could wake from. And then, across the Atlantic, America answered the call. When President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war, he didn't speak of revenge. He spoke of ideals. The world must be made safe for democracy, he said. It wasn't just a call to arms, it was a call to purpose. For the first time in history, the United States would fight not just for territory or power, but for a vision of a better world. But America was not ready for war. Its army was small, barely 200,000 men. Its weapons were outdated. Its generals had never commanded on such a scale. Yet within months, the impossible began to happen. Factories across the country roared to life. Automobile plants started building tanks. Steel mills forged artillery shells day and night. Women filled the jobs left vacant by men who had gone to fight. Farmers produced food for millions of soldiers overseas. And across small towns and big cities, young Americans lined up to enlist. They were teachers, farmers, students, mechanics, ordinary people driven by an extraordinary cause. The American Expeditionary Forces, led by General John J. Pershing, crossed the Atlantic. They called them doughboys. Their faces were young, their spirits high. They sang songs on the ships heading to Europe, not yet understanding what awaited them on the other side. When they arrived, they found a world they couldn't have imagined. Cities reduced to rubble, skies filled with smoke, trenches stretching to the horizon, reeking of death and mud. Soldiers who had been fighting for years looked at the Americans with disbelief and hope. The fresh troops brought energy the Allies had long since lost. At first, Pershing refused to scatter American units under British and French command. He wanted them to fight as a united American army. Europe had seen too much chaos. He wanted America's contribution to be decisive, not diluted. By 1918, U.S. troops began to pour into the front lines. Over 2 million Americans would eventually serve in Europe. Their arrival changed everything. Germany knew time was running out. Its people were starving. Its allies, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, were falling apart. So, in one final desperate move, Germany launched a massive offensive in the spring of 1918. They threw everything they had left at the Western Front, hoping to win before American strength could fully arrive. The German attack smashed into Allied lines, pushing deep into France. Paris itself trembled. But this time, there was no collapse. The Allies stood firm, with Americans in the line. At Château-Thierry, the U.S. Marines made their stand. Under relentless fire, they held their ground and pushed the enemy back. At Belleauwood, they charged through machine gun nests and forests of shattered trees. When told to retreat, a Marine famously replied, "Retreat? Hell, we just got here." The battle was brutal, but it proved something powerful. The Americans could fight. The victories came one after another. The Second Battle of the Marne, Saint-Mihiel, and finally the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the largest operation in U.S. military history at that time. For 47 days, more than 1 million American soldiers fought through forests, hills, and trenches under constant shell fire. The cost was staggering, tens of thousands killed or wounded, but their determination broke the back of the German army. Meanwhile, inside Germany, the truth was spreading. Their empire was collapsing, food was scarce, soldiers were deserting, and back home, the people had had enough. The Kaiser fled into exile. The German government pleaded for peace. On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the guns finally fell silent. After 4 years, the world's deadliest war was over. In the muddy ruins of Europe, soldiers emerged from trenches in stunned silence. Birds returned to skies that had known only smoke. The echoes of gunfire faded, leaving only the sound of wind across broken land. The war that was supposed to last months had consumed an entire generation. More than 16 million dead, another 20 million wounded, empires destroyed, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, Russia's monarchy, and Germany's Kaiserreich all gone. The map of the world had been redrawn in blood, and across the ocean, America stood transformed. It had entered the war as a hesitant observer and emerged as a global power. Its industries had expanded, its military proven, and its ideals carried across the seas. For the first time, the United States had taken a leading role in shaping the world's future. But peace was not as simple as victory. In 1919, world leaders gathered in Paris to decide the fate of nations. The Treaty of Versailles aimed to ensure that a war like this could never happen again. Germany was forced to take full blame for the war, to pay enormous reparations and surrender territory. Its army was limited, its pride shattered. The treaty satisfied vengeance but ignored mercy, and that mistake would come back to haunt the world. While Europe argued over punishment, President Wilson proposed something different, a new vision of peace. He called it the 14 Points, a plan to end secret treaties, allow nations self-determination, and create a League of Nations, a place where countries could resolve conflicts with words, not weapons. It was an idea ahead of its time, noble, idealistic, and fragile. Europe's leaders agreed to form the League, but America never joined. The U.S. Senate rejected it, fearing it would drag America into future wars. Wilson's dream of a peaceful, cooperative world began to fade before it even started. At home, America turned inward. The soldiers returned heroes, but many were broken, haunted by what they had seen. Families welcomed them with pride and tears. Factories shut down wartime production, and across the nation, people asked themselves what it had all been for. The 1920s brought prosperity, jazz, and the illusion that the world had moved on. But beneath the surface, the seeds of another disaster were already growing. Germany's humiliation festered into anger. Economic depression deepened suffering. And a generation later, another man would rise, promising revenge for Versailles. His name was Adolf Hitler. The war to end all wars had, in truth, only set the stage for an even greater one. Yet despite its failures, World War I changed everything. It was the birth of the modern age, of tanks, airplanes, and machine warfare. It redefined politics, technology, and society. And it taught the world that progress without humanity leads only to destruction. For America, it was the moment it became more than a nation. It became a symbol. A country that had once stayed isolated had stepped into the chaos of the world and made a difference. Its soldiers fought not to conquer, but to restore balance. And though peace didn't last, their courage changed history. A century later, the echoes of 1914 still linger. Borders drawn in that war shaped the modern Middle East. Alliances formed then evolved into today's global networks. The lessons of that conflict still warn us about pride, power, and the price of ignoring peace. Why did World War I start? Because of one bullet, one man, or one empire? It started because nations forgot how fragile peace really is. Because pride blinded leaders. Because progress outpaced wisdom. And because humanity, for all its brilliance, still struggles to control its own ambition. In the end, it was a tragedy written by everyone and suffered by all. But from that darkness came a truth that endures. Peace must be built, not assumed. October 9th, 2150 Mehertha. Booze, protected, not postponed. And remembered, not rewritten. The spark that started in Sarajevo set the world on fire. But it also lit the path toward understanding how easily we can lose everything, and how vital it is to never let it happen again. October 9th, 2150 Mehertha. Booze, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And the echoes of 1914 still whisper through the headlines of today. If you found this story powerful, subscribe for the next chapter, where we uncover how the Treaty of Versailles paved the road to World War II. Because sometimes peace can be more dangerous than war.